At Lake Powell, the water is being watched against one number: 3,490 feet, the minimum power pool where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate hydropower normally. That is what makes this moment different. A reservoir can look low for years and still seem distant from crisis, because drought often arrives as a slow emergency. But here, the Bureau of Reclamation has warned that without major intervention, Lake Powell could fall below that critical power threshold this season. This is not just a shoreline problem. It is not just a boating problem. It is a machine problem, a river problem, a system problem. But that is not the most frightening part. The real warning is not only that Lake Powell could approach minimum power pool. The real warning is that keeping it above that line now requires emergency choices, holding back releases, moving water from upstream reservoirs, and testing assumptions built into one of the most important dams in the American West. So, what happens when a reservoir created to stabilize a region becomes the unstable part of the region? What does Glen Canyon Dam reveal about the future of water, electricity, law, farming, cities, and climate in a basin that no longer receives water on the old schedule? Like, subscribe, and leave a comment with the place where this story finds you, because the next water crisis may already be moving towards someone else's map. The scene is not only a lake, it is a chain of dependence stretched across the dry interior of the American West. At the top of that chain are the mountains, where winter snow is supposed to sit like a frozen bank account. Snow accumulates, waits, melts, and becomes runoff. That runoff feeds the Colorado River. The river feeds Lake Powell. Lake Powell presses against Glen Canyon Dam. The dam releases water downstream, sends electricity outward through transmission lines, and helps maintain a legal rhythm between states that have built cities, farms, power contracts, and entire local economies around the assumption that the river will keep arriving. Now that rhythm is unstable. The people affected are not only the ones who can stand on the rim of Lake Powell and see the pale mineral bathtub ring wrapped around the canyon walls. They include families in Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, who depend on Colorado River water in different ways. They include public power customers tied to the Western Area Power Administration. They include irrigation districts watching allocations. They include tribal communities whose water rights, infrastructure gaps, and historical claims sit inside the same overstrained basin. They include workers in Page, Arizona, where the lake is not an abstraction, but a local economy of ramps, marinas, guides, repairs, hotels, and seasonal jobs. They include farmers downstream who may never see Glen Canyon Dam in person, but still feel its decisions through the timing and volume of releases. That is what makes the scene so tense. The crisis does not look like a single broken bridge or a flooded street. It looks like a huge blue reservoir quietly losing the vertical height that allows a dam to behave like a dam. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, long-term drought has reduced total Colorado River system storage to about 36% of capacity. The same agency has described the combination of record-low snowpack and record-breaking March heat as a direct threat to essential water and power infrastructure. Those phrases sound bureaucratic, but underneath them is a simple image. The water supply system of the Southwest is entering the warm season without the snow reserve it expected, and with heat arriving early enough to steal some of the runoff before it ever becomes usable river water. This is the first layer of the emergency, not the dam, not yet. The first layer is the mountains failing to refill the river at the scale the system was built around. Lake Powell is the second layer. It is the great storage basin behind Glen Canyon Dam, a reservoir designed to hold water from wet years and release it in dry ones. But when dry years stack on top of one another, storage stops being a cushion and starts becoming a countdown. Each foot of elevation matters because it is not just water on a chart. It is pressure. It is operational room. It is the difference between water moving through turbines and water being forced through lower outlets that were not designed to replace normal dam operations indefinitely. The official warning is direct. Reclamation's April 24-month study projected that Lake Powell could fall below 3,490 feet, the minimum power pool level, by August without major intervention. That sentence is the center of the field report. Not because August is destiny. Forecasts change. Releases can change. Weather can change. Emergency operating decisions can change. But because the projection revealed how close the system had come to a line that was once treated as remote. Minimum power pool is not dead pool. That distinction matters. Water can still exist in the reservoir below that elevation. The river does not simply vanish, but below minimum power pool, Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate hydropower normally. The water level is too low to push through the penstocks and turbines in the way the power plant requires. The dam loses one of its central functions, and for Glen Canyon Dam, that function is enormous. The power plant has 8 generators and a total capacity of about 1,320 megawatts. In ordinary terms, it is not a small accessory bolted onto a water project. It is a major energy asset, one whose output is marketed across multiple western states. When the reservoir falls, that electricity becomes harder to produce. When hydropower falls, replacement power must come from somewhere else. It may cost more. It may arrive under hotter conditions. When air conditioners are already demanding more from the grid, it may strain utilities and public power customers that counted on the dam as part of a reliable portfolio. But the power issue is only the visible warning light. The deeper concern is that Glen Canyon Dam is part of the plumbing of the Colorado River. It regulates the movement of water from the upper basin toward the lower basin. It helps shape flows through the Grand Canyon. It sits upstream of Lake Mead, Hoover Dam, cities, irrigation districts, tribal lands, wildlife habitat, and international obligations with Mexico. When Lake Powell approaches minimum power pool, the question is not only whether turbines can spin, the question is how much flexibility remains in the entire system. That is why the official response has not been passive. Reclamation has moved to protect the Colorado River system through emergency operations, including reduced releases from Glen Canyon Dam and additional water from upstream storage, especially Flaming Gorge Reservoir. These measures are not ordinary housekeeping. They are signs that the managers of the river are trying to keep Powell above the level where power generation fails and release capacity becomes more constrained. For someone standing at the lake, the crisis may appear as receding water. A ramp extends farther than it used to. A marina shifts. A canyon wall shows old waterlines like scars. Boats sit where open water once seemed permanent. The landscape looks exposed, as if the lake is confessing its own history foot by foot. For someone downstream, the crisis appears differently. It may appear as a negotiation, a shortage declaration, a changed release schedule, a higher power bill, a crop decision, a water order, a delayed project, or a conservation rule. It may appear as a question asked inside a city utility office. How much Colorado River water can be counted on next year? It may appear inside a farm budget. Which field gets planted if the allocation tightens? It may appear inside a tribal water planning meeting. How does a community secure infrastructure in a basin where every unused drop is already being watched by someone else? This is why the viewer should care, even if Lake Powell is far away. The lake is not a remote scenic place having a local problem. It is one of the main storage organs of a river system that supports more than 40 million people. The Bureau of Reclamation says the Colorado River supports water supply, hydropower, agriculture, recreation, fish and wildlife habitat, and other benefits across 7 basin states. In other words, Lake Powell is not only a reservoir, it is part of the West's operating system. And operating systems fail in stages. First, the margins shrink. Then the emergency measures become routine. Then old rules need exceptions. Then exceptions become the new rules. Then a number that used to live in technical documents becomes a public phrase. Minimum power pool, 3,490 feet. A line most people never needed to know. Now that line has entered the public story. The severity lies in that change. A dam built for storage, power, and control is being pushed toward a condition where every foot of elevation carries political, electrical, ecological, and legal weight. The river is no longer just flowing through concrete. It is flowing through contracts, homes, farms, power bills, court claims, habitat requirements, and heat-stressed cities. The water moves from the mountains into a reservoir, from the reservoir into turbines, from turbines into grids, from grids into homes, from releases into fields, from fields into food, from food into household budgets. A falling reservoir becomes a human system. The haunting part of the scene at Glen Canyon is that nothing has to break dramatically for the danger to be real. No wall has to collapse. No siren has to sound. The failure mode can be quieter than that. It can be a reservoir slipping below a working threshold. It can be a power plant losing head. It can be managers holding back water to protect a dam, while downstream users watch the consequences move toward them. It can be a river system that still functions, but only by narrowing the choices available to everyone inside it. That is the true scene at Lake Powell. It is not a lake simply going down. It is a system running out of room to pretend that the old baseline still exists. 3,490 feet sounds like an elevation. It sounds like a surveyor's number, the kind of number that belongs in an engineering table, not in the public imagination. But at Lake Powell, that number is becoming something else. It is becoming the line between a reservoir that still powers a dam and a reservoir that forces the dam into a different, narrower, more dangerous kind of operation. The number is measured above sea level. That detail matters because the lake is not being measured by how deep it looks from a boat ramp or how wide it appears from a viewpoint. It is being measured by elevation. Imagine the surface of Lake Powell as the top of a giant moving platform. When that platform is high, water presses into the dam with enough height, enough weight, enough force to move through the penstocks and spin the turbines inside Glen Canyon Power Plant. When that platform falls too low, the water is still there, but the machine begins to lose the vertical pressure it was built to use. That pressure has a name in hydropower. It is called head. Head is the height difference between the reservoir surface and the outlet where water exits through the turbine system. More head means more stored energy in the water. Less head means less energy. At Glen Canyon Dam, the headline is not only the volume of water left in Lake Powell. The headline is the height of that water against the dam. This is why 3,490 feet is not just another low-water milestone. It is minimum power pool. Below that level, Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate hydropower normally. The turbines are no longer the reliable path through which water and energy move together. A reservoir that once worked like a charged battery begins to behave more like a heavy tank with fewer usable valves. There is another number behind that number. Full pool at Lake Powell is about 3,700 feet. At minimum power pool, the lake surface is roughly 210 feet lower than that. 210 feet can sound small compared with a canyon landscape, but in a dam, vertical feet are not cosmetic. They are the working room of the system. They are the pressure column. They are the distance that turns stored water into controllable release, electricity, revenue, and operational flexibility. A person standing on the shore may see rock. An engineer sees head loss. A power marketer sees shrinking generation. A water manager sees less room to absorb another bad forecast. A farmer downstream sees the beginning of a sentence that may end in a changed allocation. A city utility sees uncertainty moving from the mountains into spreadsheets. The same number becomes many different warnings, depending on where a person stands in the system. Then comes the second headline number, 2.78 million acre-feet. Reclamation's April projection placed Lake Powell's minimum probable inflow for the water year at just 2.78 million acre-feet, about 29% of the historical average. That is not a small miss. That is the river arriving with less than 1/3 of what the old record would lead the system to expect under average conditions. An acre-foot is a unit built for Western water. It means enough water to cover 1 acre of land 1 foot deep. In household language, 1 acre-foot is about 325,851 gallons. So when officials talk about millions of acre-feet, they are not speaking in decorative numbers. They are describing the water supply of cities, fields, reservoirs, ecosystems, and power plants in a unit large enough to handle the scale of the Colorado River. 2.78 million acre-feet is roughly 900 billion gallons of water. That number is enormous to a person. It is almost impossible to picture. But to the Colorado River system, in a dry year, it is not enough. That is the brutal mismatch at the center of this story. A number that sounds gigantic at human scale can still be dangerously small at basin scale. That is what makes the headline so unsettling. The West is not watching a dry ditch. It is watching one of the largest reservoirs in the United States struggle under numbers that remain huge and yet inadequate. Lake Powell can still hold vast quantities of water. Glen Canyon Dam still stands. The river still flows. But the margin that once separated normal operations from emergency decisions has thinned to a technical band of elevation measured in feet. And feet are deceptive. A single foot of elevation in a reservoir like Lake Powell does not equal a neat rectangle of water. The shape of the canyon changes as the lake drops. Shorelines contract, side canyons narrow, storage relationships become uneven. A foot near one elevation may represent a different amount of water than a foot somewhere else. But politically and operationally, each foot near minimum power pool becomes heavier, because every loss pushes the system closer to a hard functional boundary. This is not like watching a gas tank move from half full to slightly less than half full. It is more like watching an aircraft descend toward a runway with fuel still in the tanks, but with the instruments warning that the engines may not have the conditions they need for normal operation. The question is not whether any water remains. The question is whether the remaining water is in the right place, at the right height, with the right pressure, to do the jobs the system demands. That is the part often missed in casual discussions about Lake Powell. People hear that there is still water below minimum power pool and assume the crisis is exaggerated, but the issue is not the existence of water. The issue is usable water through the intended machinery. A dam is not just a wall holding back a lake. It is a controlled passage system. It has intakes, penstocks, turbines, outlet works, gates, and operating rules. When the reservoir falls, those passages do not all remain equally useful. At normal elevations, water can pass through the hydropower system, producing electricity while helping meet downstream release obligations. That is the elegant bargain of hydropower. The same water can do work before continuing downstream. But when the lake approaches minimum power pool, that bargain weakens. Less energy is produced. Turbine operation becomes more constrained. The system must rely more heavily on alternatives that may not offer the same capacity, flexibility, or economic value. The power number gives this a human scale. Glen Canyon Power Plant has 8 generators and a total capacity of about 1,320 megawatts. In an average year, it has produced around 5 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity. Those are not just technical achievements. They represent power sold across western states, revenue streams, grid planning, and the ability to respond to demand. When the lake falls, the dam does not merely become less scenic. It becomes less useful at precisely the moment heat, drought, and regional demand can make usefulness more valuable. This is why the headline number should not be treated as a cliff where everything is fine above it and everything is lost below it. The damage begins before the line. Power generation declines as head declines. Operational confidence shrinks as forecasts worsen. Emergency decisions begin before the threshold is crossed. Reclamation's intervention shows exactly that. The agency did not wait for the lake to hit 3,490 feet. It acted because the projection showed that the system was close enough for the risk to become operational. That is the difference between a dramatic disaster and an infrastructural one. A dramatic disaster announces itself with collapse. An infrastructural disaster announces itself with adjustments. A release is reduced. Water is moved from an upstream reservoir A forecast is revised. A technical threshold appears in news reports. The public hears a number it was never supposed to need. Then slowly, the meaning of that number expands. 3,490 feet is the headline. But the story hidden inside it is that the Colorado River system is being forced to spend its buffers. Snowpack is a buffer. Reservoir storage is a buffer. Hydropower flexibility is a buffer. Legal operating rules are a buffer. Emergency releases from upstream reservoirs are a buffer. When those buffers are used once, the system can call it drought response. When they are used repeatedly, the system has to ask whether the baseline itself has changed. That is why this number lands with such force. It is not the biggest number in the story. 40 million people is bigger. Millions of acre-feet are bigger. Billions of kilowatt-hours are bigger. But 3,490 feet is the number that turns an abstract basin crisis into a line on a dam. Above it, the machine still has its central function. Below it, the machine enters a different world, and that world is the real headline. The hidden problem at Lake Powell is not simply that the reservoir is low. That is the easy version of the story. It is visible from overlooks, boat ramps, satellite images, and the pale ring on the canyon walls. A falling lake gives the public a picture it can understand. Less water, more rock, longer ramps, exposed shoreline. A reservoir shrinking back into the canyon that was flooded to create it. But that picture can be misleading, because the most important danger is not only on the surface of the lake, it is inside the dam. The overlooked question is not just how much water is left. The overlooked question is how that water can move. That is the turn in the story. Lake Powell is not a bucket. Glen Canyon Dam is not a simple plug. Together, they form a machine with specific pathways. Water does not leave the reservoir in any direction it wants. It has to pass through engineered openings. The penstocks that feed the turbines, the outlet works lower in the dam, and the spillways used under very different conditions. Each pathway has a purpose. Each pathway has a limit. Each pathway depends on the elevation of the reservoir. When Lake Powell is high enough, water enters the power intakes and moves through massive pipes called penstocks. Those penstocks deliver water to turbines. The turbines spin. Electricity is generated. The same water then continues downstream into the Colorado River below the dam. In that state, the system performs multiple jobs at once. It releases water. It makes power. It produces revenue. It supports operating flexibility. It gives managers a broad set of choices. But when the reservoir falls toward minimum power pool, that elegant design begins to narrow. The water may still be physically present, but it is no longer positioned high enough to use the dam's main machinery in the normal way. The reservoir can contain water and still be functionally short of power. It can hold volume and still lose pressure. It can look like a lake and still fail to behave like the storage battery the region expects. This is the part that turns a drought story into an infrastructure story. The public often thinks of water shortages as a question of total supply. How much snow fell? How much runoff entered the river? How many acre-feet remain in the reservoir? Those are real questions. But at Glen Canyon Dam, another question sits underneath them. At what height does the remaining water? Through which opening can it be released? How much control remains if the preferred path no longer works? The answer is uncomfortable because dams are not infinitely flexible. A dam is built around design assumptions. It assumes a range of water elevations. It assumes certain release patterns. It assumes turbines will handle much of the flow during normal operations. It assumes low outlets are backup tools, not the everyday replacement for the main power system. It assumes the reservoir will fluctuate, but within a band that keeps the machine useful. Climate pressure attacks those assumptions slowly. It does not need to crack the concrete to change the dam's role. It can lower the reservoir until the dam still stands, still releases water, still appears intact, but loses one of the functions that made it valuable. That is why minimum power pool is not just a power term. It is a warning about design margins. The dam was never merely a wall. It was a wall plus a power plant, a release structure, a revenue source, a legal instrument, and a control point on a river divided among states. When the reservoir falls below the elevation needed for normal hydropower, the water system does not simply switch modes like a car changing lanes. It loses capacity, efficiency, and options. The overlooked issue is the difference between water existing and water being useful. A person can see water below minimum power pool and ask why anyone is worried. The answer is that water in the wrong place is not the same as water in the right operating position. A hospital with medicine locked behind a jammed door still has medicine, but the patient cannot use it in time. A city with fuel underground still has fuel, but the generator cannot run if the pump fails. Lake Powell below the power threshold may still contain water, but Glen Canyon Dam cannot use that water through its primary power pathway. That difference is what makes the threshold so important. The penstocks are the normal arteries of Glen Canyon Dam's hydropower system. They carry water from the reservoir to the turbines. But arteries require pressure. They require water at the right level. They require conditions that keep the machinery within safe operating range. As the reservoir drops, hydropower output declines before the final threshold is reached. The power plant does not go from full strength to silence in a single instant. It weakens as head declines, because every lost foot reduces the force pushing through the turbine system. Then, if the reservoir drops too far, the dam must depend more heavily on lower outlet works to move water downstream. These outlets are important, but they are not the same as the hydropower penstocks. They do not replace the full combination of power generation and release flexibility. They may pass water, but they do not produce the same electricity. They may keep a river moving, but they change the operating posture of the whole system. This is the hidden mechanism. A reservoir can become a bottleneck, not because all water is gone, but because the usable pathways are reduced. And bottlenecks are dangerous because they concentrate stress. If the system has many pathways, it can adapt. Water can be released while power is generated. Flows can be shaped for downstream needs. Revenue can support programs. Managers can respond to changing forecasts with more room. But if the system loses the main hydropower path, everything becomes more constrained. A release decision becomes a power decision. A power decision becomes a revenue decision. A revenue decision becomes an ecological and political decision. The dam stops being a flexible tool and becomes a narrower gate. That is the real meaning of the phrase, Glen Canyon Dam is the test. Lake Powell is the visible symptom. Glen Canyon Dam is the instrument being tested. The reservoir shows how much stress has accumulated. The dam shows whether the infrastructure built for the 20th century river can operate under a 21st century hydrology that is hotter, drier, and less forgiving. A lake can fall on a graph. A dam has to do something about it. The danger is not that Glen Canyon Dam is about to collapse. That is not the evidence. The danger is more precise and more useful to understand. The danger is that a major piece of Western infrastructure can be forced out of its normal operating envelope while millions of people still need the services attached to it. Water delivery, hydropower, downstream timing, grid support, legal compliance, ecological flow management, recreation, revenue, trust. A system does not need to fail all at once to become fragile. It only needs to lose the small component that connects one part to another. At Glen Canyon, that component is the usable passage of water through the dam. This is why the story cannot stop at the shoreline. The bathtub ring is dramatic, but it is not the whole warning. The deeper warning is a set of intakes, turbines, pipes, gates, and operating rules being pulled toward the edge of their design assumptions. The water is not simply disappearing from a lake, it is slipping out of the height range that allows the dam to turn stored water into controlled power and controlled release. Not just a low reservoir, a narrowing machine. Not just drought, a loss of operating room. Not just less water in Lake Powell, fewer safe, valuable, and reliable ways to move that water through Glen Canyon Dam. That is the part people miss when they ask whether the lake still has water. Yes, it can still have water. But the Colorado River crisis is not measured only in what remains. It is measured in what can still be used, what can still be controlled, and what must be sacrificed when the system runs out of margin. The real question is not whether water is present. The real question is whether the dam can still do what the West built it to do. The mechanism at the center of this crisis has a dry engineering name: low-head hydropower constraint. It sounds technical, almost harmless, but inside Glen Canyon Dam, it describes the moment when a reservoir loses enough height that the water can no longer push through the power system with the force the machine was built to use. Head means vertical pressure. It is the height of water above the turbine intake. A dam does not create electricity simply because water exists behind concrete. It creates electricity because elevated water wants to fall. Gravity pulls it downward. Engineers guide that falling water through penstocks, which are huge internal pipes. The water strikes turbine blades. The blades spin. The spinning turns generators. The generators send electricity into the grid. Then the same water returns to the river below the dam and continues downstream. That is the normal choreography. Stored water becomes falling water. Falling water becomes rotating steel. Rotating steel becomes electricity. Electricity becomes a light in a house, a pump in an irrigation district, a cooling system in a summer heat wave, a contract in a public power office, and revenue that supports parts of the broader Colorado River storage project. But that choreography depends on height. Picture Lake Powell as a raised tank attached to a machine. When the tank is high, water arrives at the machine with force. The turbine blades feel that pressure. The generator can work efficiently, but as the tank drops, the water still exists, yet each gallon carries less usable energy. The machine has to work with a weaker push. Output falls. Flexibility falls. The margin between normal operation and damage narrows. This is why a low reservoir can become a power crisis before it becomes an empty reservoir. The lake does not have to disappear. It only has to fall far enough that the energy stored in its elevation is no longer sufficient for the dam's main function. At Glen Canyon, that point is called minimum power pool. It is the level where the reservoir is too low for normal hydropower generation. Above that line, the dam can use its main hydropower pathway. Below it, water releases would have to rely on the river outlet works, not the turbines. The Bureau of Reclamation has warned that this could create operational issues, uncertainty for users, downstream impacts, instability in regional power and water supplies, and reduced power generation. The phrase sounds careful because agencies speak in careful language, but translated into plain English, it means the dam would no longer be operating as the West has counted on it to operate. The important part is that this is not only about electricity. It begins with electricity, but it does not end there. Hydropower at Glen Canyon is tied to water movement. Water movement is tied to downstream obligations. Downstream obligations are tied to cities, farms, tribes, habitats, and interstate agreements. When the power pathway weakens, the water pathway becomes more complicated. When the water pathway becomes more complicated, the politics of the river become sharper. That is the hidden chain. A dry winter limits mountain snow. Limited snow reduces spring runoff. Reduced runoff lowers Lake Powell. A lower Lake Powell reduces head at Glen Canyon Dam. Reduced head reduces hydropower generation. Reduced hydropower can require replacement electricity. Replacement electricity can cost more, especially when heat is raising demand. Higher costs move through utilities and public agencies. At the same time, lower reservoir elevations force water managers to protect the remaining operational room, which can affect releases, negotiations, and downstream planning. The mechanism begins in the atmosphere, but it reaches a household. It moves from a warm march into a mountain snowpack, from the snowpack into the river into Lake Powell, from the lake into penstocks, from penstocks into turbines, from turbines into the grid, from the grid into a home where someone expects the air conditioner to run during a dangerous afternoon. The same mechanism moves from a reservoir forecast into a farm office, where a grower studies water allocations and decides which field is worth planting. It moves into a tribal water department, where rights on paper still have to become pipes, pumps, and treatment systems in a basin with less room for delay. That is why the mechanism matters. It gives shape to a crisis that might otherwise look too large to understand. The name is low-head hydropower constraint, but the image is simpler. A giant battery is losing the height that lets it discharge. The battery still contains energy, but the wires are not the whole problem. The voltage is dropping. The system can still function, but it can no longer be treated as if nothing has changed. At a dam, head is not a metaphor. It is physics. Water at a higher elevation has more potential energy because gravity has farther to pull it down. When the water drops, the potential energy drops. Turbines can tolerate a range of conditions, but they are not magic. They are designed around flow, pressure, vibration, air, cavitation, and safe operating limits. If the water level falls too low, the machinery can become inefficient, unstable, or vulnerable to damage. The risk is not just that the lights go out instantly. The risk is that operators must avoid running equipment in conditions that could harm it. A turbine is not a hole in the wall. It is precision machinery under enormous stress. Water enters, accelerates, strikes, blades, changes direction, and exits. If pressure conditions shift in the wrong way, air and vapor effects can appear. Vibration can rise, efficiency can fall. The turbine can no longer be treated like a normal gate. That matters because the turbine route is valuable not only for power, but for controlled releases. This is where the outlet works enter the story. River outlet works are lower passages that can move water without sending it through the power plant. They are essential safety and operational features, but they are not the same as the hydropower system. They do not produce the same electricity. They do not carry the same economic function. They may not offer the same release flexibility across all conditions. If the system has to depend on them more heavily because the reservoir is too low for power generation, Glen Canyon Dam becomes a narrower instrument. The dam still stands, the river still moves, but the number of good choices decreases. That loss of choices is the real consequence. Infrastructure failure is often imagined as a dramatic break. A bridge falls, a levee overtops, a transformer burns. But many modern failures begin when a system remains physically present while losing its intended range of function. A hospital may still have beds but not enough nurses. A grid may still have lines but not enough reserve power. A reservoir may still have water but not enough elevation to operate its power plant. The form remains, the function erodes. Glen Canyon Dam is being tested in that exact way. The dam was built to store water for dry periods, help the upper basin meet compact obligations, regulate releases to the lower basin, and generate hydropower. Reclamation describes Glen Canyon Dam as a structure constructed to harness the Colorado River for the water and power needs of millions of people in the West. That design made sense in a system that expected wet and dry years to alternate within a manageable range. The dam could absorb variation. It could hold water after wet years. It could release water during dry years. It could turn part of that movement into electricity. But a prolonged dry period changes the math. When dry years keep arriving, storage is no longer a bridge between temporary extremes. It becomes the last reserve being spent. When heat rises, snow does not behave the way old averages suggested. It melts earlier. More water can be lost to evaporation and dry soils. Runoff can shrink even when a snowpack number appears less alarming at first glance. The reservoir receives less. The lake falls. The dam loses head. This is the quiet violence of aridification. It does not only remove water, it removes height, timing, pressure, and confidence. For the power system, the consequences are practical. Less hydropower means less low-cost, flexible generation from the dam. Other power sources may have to fill the gap. Those sources may be more expensive. They may emit more carbon. They may be less flexible during peak demand. The burden may land on public power customers, irrigation districts, rural cooperatives, municipal utilities, and agencies that do not experience the crisis as a canyon view, but as a balance sheet. For the river system, the consequences are deeper. Reduced operating room at Lake Powell can force managers to make trade-offs between protecting power generation, meeting downstream release requirements, preserving storage, supporting Lake Mead, and responding to ecological needs below the dam. A decision that looks technical can become political because every acre-foot has a claimant, a history, and a consequence. This is why the current intervention matters. Moving water from Flaming Gorge and reducing releases from Lake Powell are not random emergency gestures. They are attempts to preserve elevation, and elevation is the key to the mechanism. Water managers are not only trying to add volume, they are trying to keep the lake surface high enough that Glen Canyon Dam remains within a usable operating band. They are buying height. That phrase is important. They are buying height with upstream storage. They are buying height with reduced downstream releases. They are buying height with political agreement. They are buying height with time taken from one part of the basin and given to another. Every intervention reveals that the crisis is vertical as much as volumetric. A reservoir is not just a pool of water. It is a column of force. And once that is understood, the whole story changes. Lake Powell is not simply low. It is low in a place where height is function. Glen Canyon Dam is not simply at risk of producing less electricity. It is at risk of losing the operating geometry that connects water delivery, hydropower, revenue, legal compliance, and regional stability. The basin is not simply dry. It is dry in a way that reaches inside the machinery. This is the mechanism the bathtub ring cannot show. Rock walls reveal where the water used to be, but turbine intakes reveal what the water used to do. The crisis is not only the distance between the old shoreline and the new shoreline. It is the distance between the lake surface and the point where gravity can still be turned into power. Once that distance becomes too small, Glen Canyon Dam stops being a confident machine and becomes a question. How much water can still move? How much power can still be made? How much flexibility remains? How many emergency actions can be repeated before emergency becomes the operating model? That is the test. Not whether concrete can hold back water. Whether a 20th century water machine can keep working when the river feeding it has entered a different century. This did not begin with one bad forecast. That is the first historical lesson of Lake Powell. A reservoir does not fall toward minimum power pool because one winter failed, one spring warmed too fast, or one runoff season came in low. It falls there because a long sequence of deficits has been stored inside the system until the system can no longer hide them. For years, the Colorado River Basin has been living through a drought that was first described as severe, then historic, then something larger than the language of ordinary drought could hold. The older phrase was drought, as if the region were waiting for weather to return to normal. But the more precise word now used by many scientists is aridification, because the river is not only missing precipitation, it is operating in a warmer atmosphere that pulls more water from snow, soil, plants, reservoirs, and rivers before that water can do the work people expect from it. That distinction matters. A drought is often imagined as a temporary absence. Aridification is a change in the background conditions. A drought is a dry spell. Aridification is the landscape being moved into a hotter accounting system. The precedent reaches back to the beginning of the century. In water year 2002, unregulated inflow to Lake Powell fell to about 2.64 million acre-feet, only about 28% of average. That year became a reference point, a low water warning from the early phase of the crisis. It showed how quickly a major reservoir could be stressed when snowpack, runoff, and heat aligned badly. But it was still possible then to imagine the event as part of a brutal cycle. The river had been dry before. Maybe the basin would refill. Maybe the old average would reassert itself. Then the dry years kept coming. The Colorado River system endured temporary relief in some years, including wetter periods that lifted hopes and raised reservoir levels for a time. But the relief did not erase the structural direction. By water year 2021, Unregulated inflow to Lake Powell was about 3.5 million acre-feet, only about 36% of average, making it the second driest year on record, after 2002. That matters because 2021 did not arrive as an isolated shock. It arrived after 2 decades of declining confidence. It arrived when Lake Mead and Lake Powell were already under stress. It arrived when emergency language had already entered river management. Then came the scientific context that made the sequence harder to dismiss. A study published in Nature Climate Change by A. Park Williams and colleagues found that the period from 2000 through 2021 was the driest 22-year period in southwestern North America since at least the year 800. The study also found that human-caused climate trends accounted for about 19% of the drought severity in 2021. That does not mean every dry year was caused by climate change. It does not mean the Southwest never had natural megadroughts before. The study's warning is more exact. Natural drought variability is now occurring inside a warmer climate, and that warming is intensifying the dryness. This is the layer of evidence that turns Lake Powell from a local water problem into a climate-era case study. The Colorado River has always been variable. Its flows rise and fall. Snowpack differs from year to year. Wet years can follow dry years and temporarily refill some of the system's confidence. But when the climate warms, the same snowpack does not necessarily produce the same runoff. Warmer air increases evaporation. Warmer soils can drink more meltwater before it reaches the river. Earlier melt can shift timing. Plants can use more water over longer growing seasons. Reservoirs can lose more water to the atmosphere. The old relationship between snow in the mountains and water in the river begins to loosen. This is why a wet winter can feel like rescue and still not solve the crisis. A strong snow year can raise Lake Powell. It can buy time. It can reopen ramps. It can soften emergency forecasts. But one wet year does not repay 2 decades of structural depletion. It is like one good paycheck arriving after years of debt. It helps. It matters. It does not erase the balance sheet. That lesson became visible when Lake Powell rebounded after a wet period, but the deeper drought remained. In 2023, water levels in the lake rose after a strong winter, yet the reservoir had also fallen, that April just below 3,520 feet, its lowest level since the reservoir was filled. The lake could recover part way and still remain vulnerable. That is the strange psychology of reservoir crisis. A rise can be real and insufficient at the same time. History also shows that the current response is not the first emergency maneuver. Under the Drought Response Operations Agreement, Reclamation implemented drought response operations in 2021 and 2022, including releases from upstream units, such as Flaming Gorge and Blue Mesa, to protect critical elevations at Lake Powell. In early 2022, Reclamation also modified Glen Canyon Dam releases to hold back 350,000 acre-feet in Lake Powell. These were not ordinary moves in a normal river. They were early signs that the system was starting to protect elevation as a scarce resource. That phrase needs to be remembered. Protect elevation. Not just protect water volume, protect elevation. Protect the vertical position of the reservoir surface, because that height determines whether Glen Canyon Dam can still perform its power function. The emergency actions of the past were rehearsals for the present. They showed that managers were already thinking of Lake Powell not simply as a storage basin, but as a power pool that had to be kept above critical lines. Now, the same logic has returned with sharper edges. Reclamation's recent plan to move water from Flaming Gorge and reduce Lake Powell releases is part of the same historical pattern, but it is happening closer to the line that matters most. The basin is no longer discussing hypothetical vulnerability. It is making operational choices to keep a major dam above minimum power pool. That is the difference between a warning and a test. A warning says the system could be stressed someday. A test begins when managers have to use the tools in real time, under public pressure, with incomplete weather certainty, while every acre-foot moved in one place creates consequences somewhere else. Flaming Gorge can help Powell. But lowering Flaming Gorge affects recreation, local economies, cold water habitat, and future upstream flexibility. Holding back water in Powell can help protect Glen Canyon hydropower, but less water moving to Lake Mead can worsen downstream pressure. No action is clean. Every solution has a shadow. This is how historical drought becomes system risk. The past does not repeat as a simple copy. It returns as accumulated fragility. The drought of 2002 showed how low inflow could go. The drought of 2021 showed that another extremely dry year could arrive after the system had already been weakened. The megadrought study showed that the broader dry period was exceptional in more than 1,000 years of reconstructed history. The emergency operations of 2021 and 2022 showed that managers were already forced to use upstream reservoirs and release adjustments to protect Powell. The low elevation of 2023 showed that even a partial rebound could not restore the old sense of safety. And now, Lake Powell approaching the minimum power pool conversation shows the next stage. Not just low water, but low water at the exact place where infrastructure depends on height. That is why this is not imagination. It is not a movie scenario built from fear. It is a chain of observed events, published research, official operating decisions, and physical limits inside a dam. The river has given warnings before. The basin has responded before. But each response has narrowed the distance between emergency action and ordinary operation. The historical lesson is not that Lake Powell must cross minimum power pool at a specific moment. Forecasts change. Agencies intervene. Weather can surprise in either direction. The lesson is that the river system has repeatedly moved toward thresholds once considered distant, and each time, the managers of the basin have had to spend more of the system's stored flexibility to keep the machinery working. That is the precedent. Not one dry year, a long dry era. Not one low reservoir, a chain of reservoirs being used to rescue one another. Not one scientific paper. A growing body of evidence showing that heat changes the water math. Not one dam in trouble. A whole operating philosophy being forced to face the limits of the climate assumptions beneath it. Lake Powell's present danger is frightening because it has history behind it. The lake is not suddenly discovering scarcity. It is carrying the memory of 2002, the shock of 2021, the partial relief and incomplete recovery of 2023, and the emergency operations that have already moved water around the basin, like a doctor shifting blood from one part of a failing body to another. That is the past inside the present. And if that past says anything clearly, it is this. Glen Canyon Dam is not facing a surprise. It is facing the outcome of warnings that have been arriving for more than 20 years. The vulnerable layer in this story is not where most people first look. It is not only the exposed shoreline. It is not only the shrinking lake. It is not even only the famous concrete face of Glen Canyon Dam. The vulnerable layer is the thin set of connections that turns Colorado River water into services people actually use. Turbine blades, outlet tunnels, transmission contracts, boat ramps, irrigation orders, municipal plans, tribal water infrastructure, fish habitat, and household power bills. That is where the system can bend before it breaks. A reservoir can lose water slowly enough that the public becomes used to the image. The lake is low again. The bathtub ring is larger again. The marina has moved again. The news repeats the same visual vocabulary until danger begins to look familiar. But infrastructure has thresholds that familiarity cannot soften. A dam can appear solid while one of its functions becomes fragile. A power system can appear reliable while one of its lower-cost sources is fading. A community can appear adapted to drought while its economy is being cut one season at a time. At Lake Powell, the weak part is not the entire dam. The weak part is the operating pathway. Glen Canyon Power Plant has 8 generators and a total installed capacity of about 1,320 megawatts. In ordinary years, it has produced around 5 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity. That number can sound abstract, but its importance is very practical. This power is marketed across the West. It reaches public agencies, towns, rural electric cooperatives, irrigation districts, tribal customers, and other users connected to the Colorado River Storage Project. When the lake is high enough, falling water helps produce electricity that can be relatively flexible and valuable. When the lake falls, that same dam becomes less able to provide the service many customers planned around. This vulnerability does not begin with a blackout. It begins with replacement. If Glen Canyon hydropower declines, the missing electricity has to come from somewhere else. That replacement power may cost more. It may come from sources that are less flexible. It may arrive during hot months, when demand is already strained by air conditioning. The impact does not fall evenly. A large utility may absorb cost changes more easily than a small rural cooperative. A wealthier city may have more tools than a low-income community. A public power customer that counted on federal hydropower may experience the lake not as scenery, but as an invoice. That is how water enters a household without coming through a faucet. It begins as snow in the Rockies. It melts into the Colorado River. It pools behind Glen Canyon Dam. It loses height. It produces less power. Replacement energy costs rise. A local utility adjusts its budget. A family sees pressure on rates. The mechanism has traveled from atmosphere to reservoir, to turbine, to grid, to kitchen table. The same pattern exists for water users. The Colorado River supports more than 40 million people, irrigates about 5.5 million acres of farmland, and is a crucial resource for 30 tribal nations. Those numbers are often repeated because they are huge, but the real vulnerability sits beneath them. The river is not one user. It is a crowded legal and physical system where every acre-foot can carry a claim, a contract, a crop decision, a treaty obligation, a city plan, or a habitat requirement. When Lake Powell falls toward a power threshold, the problem is not simply that one reservoir is uncomfortable. The problem is that one control point begins to send uncertainty through all those relationships. For farmers, vulnerability can be brutally specific. It may appear as the planting window. A field cannot wait forever, while agencies revise forecasts and states negotiate cuts. Seed, labor, fertilizer, equipment, and market expectations all move on calendars. If water uncertainty arrives late, the farmer does not simply lose water. The farmer loses timing. And agriculture is full of timing. A crop planted too late can become a financial loss before the first leaf fails. A water order reduced at the wrong moment can move from a canal into a field, from a field into yield, from yield into income, from income into debt, and from debt into the next season's choices. For tribal communities, the vulnerability is even deeper because the Colorado River Basin is not only a hydrologic system, it is also a history of delayed justice. Many tribal nations hold significant water rights, but rights on paper do not automatically become pipes, treatment plants, storage, pumping capacity, or reliable delivery. In a basin with less physical room, unresolved infrastructure gaps become more dangerous. The question is not only who has a legal claim to water, the question is who has the built system needed to use, store, treat, and deliver it when the basin tightens. That is a different kind of exposure. It is not visible from the tourist overlook. It is visible in homes without reliable water service, in community plans waiting for funding, in projects delayed while the river's future shrinks around them. A low Lake Powell does not create those inequities by itself, but it makes them harder to ignore because scarcity turns every missing pipe into a larger risk. In Page, Arizona, and around Lake Powell, the vulnerability is local and immediate. The lake is not just a number in a federal report. It is work. It is a dock. It is a ramp. It is a hotel room, a guide service, a repair shop, a rental boat, a summer schedule, a family income. When water drops, the distance between infrastructure and water changes. A boat ramp designed for one shoreline may no longer reach the lake. A marina may have to move. A visitor may cancel. A worker may lose hours. A community that once lived beside a stable recreational engine begins to live beside a moving target. This is not the largest consequence in the basin, but it is one of the clearest. The lake physically retreats from the infrastructure built to meet it. Concrete sits above water. Ramps point toward mud or rock. The built world and the hydrologic world no longer line up. That same mismatch appears inside the dam. The turbines were not designed to be optional decorations. They are part of the normal release and power system. The river outlet works are essential, but they are not a perfect replacement for normal hydropower operations. If Lake Powell falls below minimum power pool, water can still move through lower outlets. But the dam loses the ability to generate hydropower normally. That means the weakest link is not a massive collapse. It is a smaller, more technical loss of function. Water can pass, but not with the same value, not with the same flexibility, and not through the pathway the system was built around. That is why this crisis is more dangerous than the headline number alone. The headline says 3,490 feet. The system says, what happens to power customers, river flows, replacement energy, downstream planning, local economies, tribal infrastructure, and the legal balance between reservoirs. If that line becomes operationally relevant, a number can be crossed in a day. Its consequences can move for years. The ecological layer is also exposed. Glen Canyon Dam does not release water into a blank channel. It releases into the Colorado River through Glen Canyon and the Grand Canyon, where flows, temperature, sediment, and timing affect fish, sandbars, riparian vegetation, and recreational river use. Low reservoir levels can change release options and water temperature dynamics. A dam that loses flexibility upstream can create biological consequences downstream. The river below the dam is not separate from the reservoir. It is the next room in the same house. And then there is the political layer. The Colorado River is governed through a dense structure of compacts, laws, court decisions, contracts, guidelines, shortage rules, operating criteria, and emergency agreements. This legal architecture can appear strong because it is so elaborate, but complexity is not the same as resilience. Sometimes, complexity becomes another vulnerable layer because every emergency move must pass through negotiations, authorities, deadlines, and competing interpretations of fairness. When water is abundant, legal ambiguity can hide. When reservoirs fall, ambiguity hardens. Should water be held in Powell to protect hydropower? Should more be released to support Lake Mead and downstream users? Should upstream reservoirs be drawn down to rescue Glen Canyon? How much should cities cut? How much should farms cut? How should tribal nations be included not as an afterthought, but as sovereign governments with real water claims? What happens if one basin believes the other basin is not sharing the burden? These questions do not wait politely for ideal conditions. They arrive during heat, drought, and declining storage. That is the social vulnerability beneath the physical one. A low reservoir asks a technical question. A stressed basin answers with politics. The most fragile systems are often the ones that once seemed most impressive. Glen Canyon Dam is enormous. Lake Powell is enormous. The Colorado River infrastructure network is enormous. But scale can hide dependence on small operating details. A turbine intake, a reservoir elevation, a release schedule, a federal forecast, a snowpack measurement, a power contract, a canal gate, a pump, a ramp, a missing pipe. Those are the pieces that connect the giant system to ordinary life. And when the lake falls, each piece is asked to carry more weight. This is why the danger cannot be measured only by how much water remains in Lake Powell. The deeper danger is distribution of harm. Some people will experience the crisis as a technical briefing. Others will experience it as a rate increase. Others as a shorter irrigation season. Others as a lost job. Others as a community water project that becomes more urgent and harder to fund. Others as an ecological change downstream that cannot be reversed quickly. The same falling reservoir becomes many different emergencies, depending on who has money, infrastructure, legal power, and political visibility. That is the vulnerable layer, not the dramatic failure of a dam, the quieter failure of assumptions, the assumption that federal hydropower will be there when needed. The assumption that a reservoir can absorb another dry year, the assumption that emergency transfers from upstream storage can keep being repeated, the assumption that communities without completed water infrastructure can wait, the assumption that local economies can chase a retreating shoreline forever, the assumption that the river's legal system can negotiate faster than the climate can remove margin. Lake Powell's falling water exposes more than rock. It exposes dependence. It shows that the American West is not held together only by big reservoirs and big dams, but by small connections between physical water, engineered pathways, social promises, and daily needs. And the most haunting part is that those connections can fail unevenly. The dam may still stand, the river may still flow, some users may still receive water, some power may still be delivered, some farms may still plant, some cities may still grow. But beneath that partial functioning, weaker communities and weaker components can begin to absorb the stress first. That is how a system becomes fragile, while still appearing alive. The story now has to widen. Lake Powell is the visible crisis, and Glen Canyon Dam is the immediate test. But the system under pressure is much larger than one reservoir and one wall of concrete. It is the operating model of the Colorado River Basin itself. It is the assumption that a river divided on paper, stored in reservoirs, released through dams, priced through power contracts, and negotiated through legal agreements, can keep functioning when the physical river no longer behaves like the river those agreements expected. That is why this moment matters beyond the shoreline. A basin can survive drought if drought arrives as an exception. A reservoir system can absorb dry years if wet years come often enough to rebuild storage. A legal structure can manage conflict if the underlying supply remains close enough to the numbers everyone was trained to treat as normal. But when dry years stack together, and when hotter air takes more water from snow, soil, vegetation, and reservoirs, the whole system begins to change character. The question stops being how to survive a bad year. It becomes how to operate a river when the bad year logic is becoming part of the baseline. That is the larger pattern hidden inside Lake Powell. The Bureau of Reclamation has described total Colorado River system storage as reduced to about 36% of capacity, with the lowest winter snowpack on record and record-breaking March heat intensifying drought conditions across the basin. That sentence is not just a weather update, it is a system diagnosis. Storage is low. The natural refill mechanism is weak. Heat is interfering with runoff. Essential water and power infrastructure is at elevated risk. And more than 40 million people are tied to the outcome. The river system is not waiting for the future. It is already being operated under the pressure of it. The first sign of that new reality is that emergency measures no longer feel rare. Water is moved from upstream reservoirs to protect Lake Powell. Releases from Glen Canyon Dam are reduced to preserve elevation. Forecasts are updated, compared, and stress-tested. Basin states negotiate under the shadow of falling storage. Federal agencies prepare environmental reviews and contingency plans. Tribes, cities, irrigation districts, conservation groups, power customers, and Mexico all become part of the same tense calculation. This is what overload looks like in a water system. It does not always look like panic. It looks like process becoming heavier. More meetings, more studies, more modeling, more temporary agreements, more emergency authorities. More phrases that used to belong to technical staff entering public conversation: minimum power pool, drought response operations, release tier, unregulated inflow, post-2026 operations. The system is still functioning, but it is functioning with less room. That phrase matters because resilience is not the same as survival. A system can survive and still become less resilient. It can deliver water this year while becoming harder to operate next year. It can protect one reservoir by drawing down another. It can protect hydropower by reducing releases. It can protect a city through conservation while pushing more stress onto agriculture. It can keep the machinery moving while spending down the buffers that once made the machinery reliable. Lake Powell exposes that pattern because it sits between the upper basin and the lower basin. It is not simply a reservoir, it is a hinge. Upstream of it are mountain snowpacks, tributaries, storage units, and communities that worry about being asked to give up water they may need later. Downstream of it are Lake Mead, Hoover Dam, lower basin cities, farms, tribes, ecosystems, and treaty obligations with Mexico. When Powell falls, the hinge tightens. Every decision on one side is felt on the other. That is why Glen Canyon Dam is the real test. It tests whether the basin can still coordinate under stress. It tests whether hydropower, water delivery, ecological protection, and legal compliance can still be balanced when the reservoir loses height. It tests whether upstream and downstream users can treat the river as one connected system rather than a set of separate claims. It tests whether emergency actions can become a bridge to long-term adaptation, or whether they simply postpone the next emergency. The coming post, 2026 Operating Rules, show how serious this has become. The existing interim guidelines for lower basin shortages and coordinated operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead are set to expire at the end of 2026. Reclamation's post-2026 process is designed to identify new operational strategies for Lake Powell, Lake Mead, and other water management actions for decades ahead. The draft environmental review considers multiple alternatives and does not identify a preferred one, leaving room for a negotiated agreement. That process is not background bureaucracy. It is the basin trying to rewrite its operating manual while the engine is running. The difficulty is that the old manual was built around a river that was already overestimated. The Colorado River Compact and later agreements divided expectations that history has not consistently delivered. Reservoirs masked the mismatch for decades by storing water from wet periods and releasing it during dry ones. Growth continued. Farms kept planting. Cities expanded. Power contracts formed. But storage can hide imbalance only while storage remains large enough. Once reservoirs fall, the mismatch becomes visible. The pale bathtub ring around Lake Powell is the physical version of that mismatch. It shows where confidence used to sit. The same problem appears in Lake Mead. It appears in shortage declarations. It appears in conservation programs. It appears in negotiations between states that disagree over how to share cuts. It appears in tribal water settlements that still need infrastructure. It appears in farm districts weighing compensation against production. It appears in city water departments trying to plan for growth while telling residents conservation must deepen. It appears in ecological debates over how much water must remain in rivers for endangered species, riparian corridors, and the living canyon below the dam. This is not a single resource crisis. It is a multi-system squeeze. Water is tied to power. Power is tied to revenue. Revenue is tied to environmental programs and project repayment. Water delivery is tied to law. Law is tied to politics. Politics is tied to trust. Trust is tied to whether each side believes the other side is carrying a fair share of loss. When the physical river shrinks, the social river becomes more difficult to manage. That is the hidden system beneath the headline. The new baseline is not simply lower water. It is more volatility with less margin. It is a world in which snowpack can look promising and still produce disappointing runoff because warm soils absorb meltwater before it reaches streams. It is a world in which heat arrives early and turns a mountain snow reserve into a vanishing asset. It is a world in which reservoirs do not only store water, but also reveal how much uncertainty has accumulated. It is a world in which one wet winter may lift the lake, but not restore the old operating confidence. A new baseline does not announce itself with one official declaration. It arrives through repeated exceptions. A temporary conservation program becomes expected. An emergency release becomes precedent. A shortage tier becomes familiar. A reservoir threshold becomes common language. A post-2026 negotiation becomes not just a policy process, but a fight over what kind of river future can still be governed. That is why Lake Powell should not be read as a failure of one season. It should be read as evidence that the Colorado River system is moving from abundance management to risk management. Abundance management asks how to allocate expected supply. Risk management asks how to prevent collapse when expected supply fails. Abundance management assumes reservoirs will recover often enough. Risk management asks which functions must be protected first when they do not. Abundance management treats drought as a deviation. Risk management treats dryness, heat, and uncertainty as operating conditions. The difference is profound. In the old story, Lake Powell and Lake Mead were giant savings accounts. Water stored in one period could be spent in another. The West could build around them because they appeared to turn a variable river into a dependable asset. In the new story, the savings accounts are still there, but withdrawals have become harder to repay. Interest is negative. Heat takes a cut. Dry soil takes a cut. Evaporation takes a cut. Legal obligations take a cut. Growth takes a cut. By the time the river reaches the dam, the account balance is lower than the old budget expected. And yet, the basin cannot simply walk away from the system it built. Cities still need water. Farms still produce food. Tribal nations still need infrastructure and recognition of rights. Ecosystems still need flows. Power customers still need electricity. Mexico is still part of the river's legal and diplomatic future. The Grand Canyon is still downstream. The dam is still there. The reservoir is still there. The laws are still there. The people are still there. That is what makes this a systems crisis rather than a simple collapse narrative. The problem is not that everything ends. The problem is that everything continues while becoming harder to sustain. The response system may not be fully overloaded yet, but it is clearly being loaded in ways it was not designed to handle indefinitely. When agencies must repeatedly protect Lake Powell elevation, when new operating rules must be negotiated under drought pressure, when forecasts show inflows far below average, when storage hovers near historically low levels, and when hydropower thresholds enter public debate, the system is not operating from strength. It is operating from compression. Compression changes behavior. It makes states more defensive. It makes agencies more cautious. It makes cities invest in conservation and reuse. It makes farmers calculate risk differently. It makes tribes insist, correctly, that future river rules cannot be built without sovereign participation. It makes environmental groups watch flows and temperatures more closely. It makes power customers ask what replaces federal hydropower if the reservoir drops too far. It makes ordinary residents realize that a distant canyon lake is connected to the cost and security of modern life. This is the meaning of Lake Powell as a warning sign. The reservoir is not only showing drought, it is showing the limits of the old belief that engineering could separate the West from hydrologic uncertainty. Dams can store water, they can move water, they can produce electricity, they can smooth the river's extremes, but they cannot create snowpack. They cannot make hot air cooler. They cannot force runoff to match a legal promise. They cannot indefinitely turn a shrinking margin into a stable future. The larger question is not whether the basin has tools. It does. Conservation, demand reduction, reuse, changed reservoir operations, agricultural agreements, tribal settlements, urban efficiency, ecosystem planning, and new post-2026 rules all matter. None of that should be dismissed. The basin is not helpless. But tools are not the same as time. The more Lake Powell falls, the more the system has to act, while losing the very buffer that would make action easier. That is the pattern of risk. Less water creates harder decisions. Harder decisions take longer. Longer negotiations consume time. Time passes through another hot season. Another forecast arrives. Another reservoir elevation becomes the center of attention. And so the story widens again. It is no longer just Lake Powell approaching a line. It is a river basin approaching a question. Can a system designed to distribute a 20th century river be redesigned fast enough for a hotter, more unstable one? This is the point where the story has to slow down and separate what is known from what is assumed. A crisis like Lake Powell attracts exaggeration because it sits at the intersection of climate, water, electricity, politics, and fear. The image is powerful. A giant reservoir falling toward a line where one of the West's major dams can no longer generate hydropower normally. That image is true enough to be alarming. It does not need to be inflated. The first thing that is real is the threshold. 3,490 feet is not a media invention. It is the minimum power pool elevation for Glen Canyon Dam. Below that level, water cannot move through the penstocks in the normal hydropower pathway. It must instead rely on lower outlet works. That is a real engineering boundary, not a symbolic line. The second thing that is real is the projection. Reclamation's April 24-month study showed that Lake Powell could fall below that minimum power pool level by August without major intervention. That phrase matters, without major intervention. It means the projection was not a prophecy carved into stone. It was a warning produced under a scenario, and the warning triggered action. Releases from Lake Powell were reduced. Water from upstream storage was planned to help protect elevation. The basin did not simply watch the line approach. It moved. So, the correct statement is not that Lake Powell is guaranteed to fall below minimum power pool by August. The correct statement is more precise and more serious. Official modeling showed that it could fall below that line without emergency operations, and those operations reveal how narrow the margin has become. Precision makes the warning stronger, not weaker. The third thing that is real is the hydropower risk. Glen Canyon Dam does not need Lake Powell to be empty before power generation is threatened. It needs water high enough to maintain the hydraulic head required for normal turbine operation. When the lake falls, generation declines. If the lake falls below minimum power pool, normal hydropower generation stops. That is not speculation. That is the basic physics and design of the dam. But this is where false claims often begin. Minimum power pool is not dead pool. It does not mean the reservoir is empty. It does not mean the Colorado River disappears below the dam. It does not mean every city immediately runs out of water. Dead pool is lower, near the elevation where water can no longer be released through the dam by gravity under normal outlet conditions. Confusing minimum power pool with dead pool turns an already serious engineering problem into a misleading apocalypse story. That confusion should be rejected. The fourth thing that is real is the infrastructure concern. If Lake Powell falls below the power threshold, Glen Canyon Dam becomes more dependent on the river outlet works. Official post-2026 environmental review documents state that Glen Canyon Dam was not envisioned to operate below minimum power pool, and that extended use of the river outlet works raises infrastructure concerns. That does not mean the dam is about to collapse. It means the dam could be pushed into an operating mode that was not intended to replace its normal long-term function. That distinction matters because fear often looks for the biggest possible failure. But systems often become dangerous through smaller, more technical failures first. A turbine pathway lost, a release capacity constrained, a repair risk increased, a revenue stream reduced, a downstream schedule altered. The dam does not have to break for the system around it to become more fragile. The fifth thing that is real is the climate connection, but it must be stated carefully. Human-caused warming has increased the severity of the Southwest's long dry period, and warmer conditions can reduce runoff by increasing evaporation, drying soils, changing snowmelt timing, and raising water demand. That is connected to Lake Powell's crisis. But no honest explanation should say that climate change alone caused one reservoir level on one forecast date. The Colorado River crisis also includes overallocation, decades of demand growth, reservoir operations, legal commitments, natural variability, agricultural use, urban growth, and political delay. The stronger statement is this: climate change is not the only force in the basin, but it is making the old water math less reliable. Some things are related but not identical. A hot March is related to runoff risk, because heat can damage snowpack and accelerate losses. But a hot month by itself does not explain the entire reservoir crisis. Low snowpack is related because snow is the river's main seasonal storage. But snowpack alone is not the whole story. If dry soils absorb meltwater, before it reaches streams. Population growth is related because demand increases pressure. But growth alone does not explain why the same mountain snow can now produce less runoff under hotter conditions. Agriculture is related because it uses a large share of Colorado River water. But blaming farmers alone ignores cities, laws, food systems, tribal claims, power systems, and the fact that the river was divided under assumptions that were too optimistic from the beginning. The truth is not simple. That is exactly why it is dangerous. Some things are only coincident in time. A wildfire season in another state, a heat wave in another region, or a separate power shortage may share the same climate background without being directly caused by Lake Powell's level, a drought map, a reservoir graph, and an electricity price spike can appear together and still require careful separation. Correlation is not a mechanism. A serious analysis does not place every alarming event into one chain unless the physical links are clear. Some things remain uncertain. The exact elevation of Lake Powell in a future month depends on inflow, precipitation, temperature, upstream releases, demand, policy decisions, evaporation, and operational changes. A forecast is not a photograph of the future. It is a model of possible futures based on assumptions. When the assumptions change, the forecast changes. That is not a weakness of science. That is how real-time water management works. The risk, however, does not vanish because the forecast changes. If emergency operations keep Lake Powell above minimum power pool, that is good news for the dam's immediate function. But it does not prove the system is safe. It proves that the system had to use emergency operations to remain inside a critical boundary. A patient stabilized in an emergency room is not the same as a healthy patient. Stabilization matters. It can save time. It can prevent a worse outcome. But it also confirms that the body was under stress. That is the honest middle ground. Not panic, not dismissal. The real risk is not that Glen Canyon Dam is guaranteed to fail at a specific date. The real risk is that the Colorado River system is being forced closer to hard engineering thresholds, while still carrying legal, social, ecological, and economic demands built around a more forgiving river. The real risk is loss of margin. The real risk is that emergency measures become normal management. The real risk is that every solution shifts stress somewhere else, from Lake Powell to Flaming Gorge, from Lake Powell to Lake Mead, from hydropower customers to replacement power markets, from present releases to future flexibility. That is what should remain after the exaggerations are removed. Lake Powell is not a hoax. It is not a simple countdown to collapse. It is not only a climate story. It is not only a water use story. It is not only an engineering story. It is a convergence point, where all of those forces meet inside one reservoir elevation. And the most credible warning is also the most unsettling one. The dam does not need a dramatic disaster to reveal the future. It only needs to approach a line where the ordinary way of operating no longer works. At the beginning, there was one image, a reservoir falling toward a line most people were never supposed to know. 3,490 feet. It was not a dramatic number. It did not sound like thunder. It did not look like fire. It did not move across the screen like floodwater through a street or smoke over a ridge. It sat quietly in an official forecast, measured above sea level, attached to a phrase from engineering language, minimum power pool. But by the end of this story, that number has become more than a lake elevation. It has become a question asked of a dam, a river, a power system, a legal structure, and a civilization that built its confidence around stored water. Lake Powell may be kept above that line through emergency operations. Releases can be reduced. Water can be moved from upstream reservoirs. Forecasts can improve. A season can change. A storm can arrive. A wet year can lift the lake and give the system more time. None of that should be dismissed. Time matters. Avoiding a threshold matters. Stabilizing a reservoir matters. But the warning is not erased by the fact that managers still have tools. The warning is that those tools are now being used to protect a line that once seemed distant. That is the deeper meaning of Glen Canyon Dam. It is not simply a concrete wall holding back the Colorado River. It is a machine built around assumptions that the river would bring enough water often enough, that reservoirs could smooth the difference between wet and dry, that hydropower could ride on top of water delivery, that legal promises could be managed through storage, and that dry years would remain exceptions inside a larger pattern of recovery. Those assumptions are now exposed like the pale rock around Lake Powell. The frightening part is not that every assumption has failed completely. The frightening part is that each one is under stress at the same time. The snowpack is less reliable. The runoff is less predictable. The reservoirs are lower. The heat is stronger. The legal negotiations are more urgent. The power system is less able to take federal hydropower for granted. The communities with the least infrastructure are being asked to face a tighter future with the smallest margin. This is how a climate signal becomes a systems risk. It does not move in a straight line. It travels through connections. It moves from warm air into snow, from snow into runoff, from runoff into Lake Powell, from Lake Powell into turbine pressure, from turbine pressure into electricity, from electricity into public power contracts, from those contracts into budgets, bills, and households. It moves from reservoir elevation into release decisions, from release decisions into Lake Mead, from Lake Mead into cities, farms, tribal claims, ecosystems, and treaties. It moves from a technical forecast into a political argument over fairness. A falling lake becomes a map of dependence. That is why the story cannot end with either panic or comfort. Panic would say, the dam is about to collapse, the river is finished, and the West has no future. That is not what the evidence shows. Glen Canyon Dam is not being described as a structure on the edge of physical collapse. Water managers are not helpless. Conservation, operating changes, tribal settlements, agricultural agreements, reuse, demand reduction, and new basin rules can all change the outcome. Comfort would say the system has handled drought before, reservoirs rise and fall, and one more intervention proves the danger was exaggerated. That is also not what the evidence shows. Emergency operations are not evidence that the old system is healthy. They are evidence that the old system needs help staying inside its operating limits. The truth sits in the harder middle. Lake Powell is not only a low reservoir, it is a reservoir low enough to make a major dam's operating geometry a public issue. Glen Canyon Dam is not only a source of hydropower, it is a test of whether 20th century infrastructure can keep functioning inside 21st century hydrology. The Colorado River is not only a river in drought, it is a river whose old averages no longer carry the same authority they once did. That is the central message. The event will change. The forecast will change. The lake may rise. The lake may fall. Managers may succeed in keeping Powell above minimum power pool this season. Future storms may buy relief. Future negotiations may buy adaptation. But the thing revealed by this crisis will remain. The American West is being forced to learn the difference between water that exists and water that still performs the jobs built around it. A reservoir can still hold water and lose power. A dam can still stand and lose flexibility. A river can still flow and no longer support every promise made in its name. That is the unsettling lesson of Glen Canyon. It shows that the future may not arrive as a single breaking point. It may arrive as a narrowing. Fewer good choices, fewer buffers, fewer spare reservoirs to rescue another reservoir, fewer assumptions that can survive another hot, dry year without being rewritten. And yet, the ending cannot be only despair, because despair is another form of avoidance. It allows a system to be declared lost before the hard work begins. The Colorado River Basin still has choices. It can reduce demand before crisis makes the cuts harsher. It can include tribal nations as central governments, not late-stage stakeholders. It can treat hydropower, water delivery, ecology, farming, and cities as one linked system instead of separate arguments. It can stop using emergency operations as a substitute for long-term redesign. But those choices become harder the longer the basin waits. The image at the end is the same as the image at the beginning. Lake Powell pulled back from the canyon walls. the pale ring above the waterline, Glen Canyon Dam holding a reservoir that is still vast and yet no longer as secure as it once appeared. The concrete remains. The turbines remain. The river remains. The question is whether the operating model around them can change quickly enough. This crisis may pass. The lake may stay above the line. The immediate danger may be delayed. But what it revealed will not disappear with one better forecast. It revealed a system built to master variability, now confronting a climate that is changing the range of that variability. It revealed that the smallest technical thresholds can carry the weight of entire regions. It revealed that the future of the Colorado River will not be decided only by how much water falls from the sky, but by how honestly people respond when the old baseline no longer returns. And that is why 3,490 feet matters. Not because it is the end, because it is the line where the West has to stop pretending that the past can still run the machine.